Alrighty, we are live. Hello and welcome to this exciting talk. We are hanging out. I am Zach Winthy, Director of Product Marketing at Telium, and today I have a very special guest. But before I switch to him, a couple housekeeping notes. We are going to spend 20, 30 minutes talking about the rise of the Customer Data Strategist. It was a document we put out, research report earlier this year. And the goal is to kind of dive into some background and some history on, where that role may be coming from, where it's going. But if you have questions along the way, you can submit them. We'll take them either as we're going or definitely have some time for Q&A at the end. But if you haven't read the report, we will drop a link to access that ebook so you can take a look and read it. But in the meantime, without further ado, I want to introduce my guest here. We go way back. We've been running in similar circles for many years in the data space, and I'm excited to have this chat with him because in many ways he kind of epitomizes this role in various parts of his career. As do I. So this will be a fun chat. So I will let Arpit introduce himself so he does a better job than I do.
Thank you, Zach. Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here. It's almost a full circle moment for me because, this is exactly the role that got me into the data space back in 2019, early 2020, mid 2019. I was basically working with this company called Integromat, which is now probably known as Make.com.
Yep.
And we were a tiny startup back then. I was one of the early go-to-market hires. And we were growing really fast, but we didn't really have a data team. We didn't have a fancy data stack. We didn't even have the budgets for any of fancy tooling or even the CDP because we were a bootstrap company. And that's when I got really into the space. I learned, whatever I could learn from free resources online. And that's when I really understood the importance of, collecting clean data and as a head of growth or, basically someone running product, to know exactly what data you want to capture. And we went through this process fairly slowly because we were, again, a bootstrap company, not a lot of resources, but that actually allowed me to fully understand what it takes to build a robust data infrastructure. Even though we were at the time we were adding 1,000 new users every day, we didn't really have data tracking in place. But eventually I ended up working with a couple of our ACE engineers to set up our tracking, the first version of our tracking. We built an internal service, but we knew exactly which events we wanted to track, which properties for each event, the data types of each property, and exactly how we'd use that data. At the time, some people thought this is unnecessary or it's taking too much time, but it really paid off in the long run. So that's when I got really deep into the data space. The timing was also great because the whole modern data stack space was blossoming with all the awesome new tools and technologies in early 2020. Thankfully, I got a front row seat to what was happening, and it was a really exciting time for me. In some ways, even more exciting than it is now, to be honest. So. And then I spent 5 years working in the data space, as you know, with various data companies in various capacities. And I also created a couple of side projects. As you know, I ended up selling one to Amplitude, which was essentially just about, what it entails to be. We weren't really calling this role a data strategist role, but what it takes to sort of understand how data is collected, stored, moved, analyzed, and acted upon as a non-data person, someone working in a data adjacent role like product marketing and growth. So that was my motivation to start, writing about the stuff that I was doing, the stuff I had learned, and there was a real need for that. And things have been pretty great since then. And even though we've made a lot of progress in tech and AI has come a long way, some of those fundamentals are still very much in place. And I still see the problems, or rather the downstream impact of not having those basics in place, which in the early days seem a bit redundant, but it really takes you a long way. So So yeah, I also run a, I've almost forgot to mention, I got so excited. I also run a community called Semi-Technicals, which is essentially for people who reject the non-technical title, like I always did. People would often ask me, hey, are you technical? Are you non-technical? Are you an engineer? And well, I'm not an engineer. I don't write code, but I'm far from non-technical, right?
Yep.
And this has been pretty much my platform for the longest time. But I wanted to zero in on this term semi-technicals, as more and more people are starting to sort of identify as a semi-technical. So yeah, it's a free invite only community for people who just want to be in a space where you know people who are not necessarily technical and engineers, but they're far from non-technical. So yeah.
Yeah, I always describe myself as I'm a marketer, but I'm also a nerd, and so that's how I kind of moved out of marketing into consulting, because I knew what API meant and I could kind of translate. And for years in MarTech and in other categories, we've had Scott Brinker obviously termed it as marketing technologist. It was the person who drove integration, and you've kind of been at the forefront or obviously talking about this topic for a while. But I think as we've seen, especially over the last year, enterprises and organizations are catching up with this growing trend that we need more than the people who just work on the data, right? More than the data engineers, more than which are very important, but have always been kind of recognized. And then we also know that there's the consumers, the people who get value from the data, right? Whether it's the marketing team or ops or, the revenue teams who are, consuming that data. But now this growing need, and to even talk about it more broadly is like the translator, right? The person who sits between those two kind of, modalities or mentalities of I write SQL versus I run campaigns. And we saw it on the integration side, and now as data becomes more and more crucial, this shift. Talk to me about how have you seen enterprises start to buy into this? Obviously, as you talk to the people who are those semi-technicals, who I think fit in this category in a lot of ways, where are they seeing kind of success in their enterprises, or people starting to, I guess, buy into that idea?
Yeah, well, I would start by saying that there's still a lot of resistance, because companies still want to sort of box people into, you're a data person, you're a non-data person. And my whole, the whole idea behind Data Beats, my previous blog, which is still sort of active, is was to beat the gap between data people and non-data people for good. Because today, the lines are blurry, and it's just not a great idea to sort of box someone into this data or non-data persona, because the kind of work that we're talking about, a customer data strategist, is not necessarily a traditional data person as in a data engineer or a data analyst, or a machine learning engineer. They may not even know Python. They don't need to, right? They don't need to build data pipelines. What they do need to know is how exactly, what is the process of making data available to teams that need that data in their day-to-day, marketing, product growth, ops, etc. Often this person might sit, in an ops team, depending on how companies structure their organizations. But this has never been a first class role, right? Because for most companies, um, the data teams are the ones who own this process, and that creates that divide. Because if I put on my marketer hat, or a growth person's hat, I know that I want to run this campaign or create a bunch of whatever in-app experiences, and I know that I want these data points, right? I want these events and I want these properties to go along with those events. But most people, they're not given the opportunity to sort of be so, I would say, specific about what they want, because they'll often be asked oh, so what is it that you're trying to do? And then the data team will sort of prescribe, okay, this is what you need to do, right? So for someone who really knows what they want to do and they want to sort of be very specific about what data they want to use and how, there's always a bit of friction. That said, I think this person or this persona can bring tremendous value, because very rarely it's also a role that not a lot of people want to be in, because like you said, it's the translator's role. It requires a lot of it requires you to understand the needs and priorities and constraints of both sides, right?
Yeah.
Like data teams are inundated with what, like, requests and questions all the time. Like, no matter how big the organization gets, or how big the data team gets, or how much technology they adopt, like, people still have questions for data people. So, and this stuff takes time, it takes deliberation, it really needs someone to understand the product. Like, if you don't deeply understand the product and the features, you won't really know what data to track, right? So I would say, like, in terms of adoption, like, typically companies will leave this role to a marketing ops person or a rev ops person, or um, like, there's a growing trend of building a GTM ops team,
Yep.
which actually sort of pretty much sits between the data engineering teams, as well as and the rest of the organization. So product, marketing, and sales, and the other ones who are acting as translators. But even then, I think, like, I used to refer to this persona as a tracking manager. Like, there should be one person who's like the go-to person, even for like product managers when they're releasing new features. For instrumentation, they there should be this go-to person that they can go to and be like, hey, we're building this feature, we're experimenting with this feature, and we should get this built sooner rather than later. This is when we're launching the feature, etc. And similarly, I'd say, for like a marketing person who's trying to launch a campaign, they should be able to go to this tracking person and say that this is what we're trying to do. Do we have this data available? Because often when someone, like a new person, when they join a team, they don't really know what data is even available. Very few teams maintain, a very detailed tracking plan or a data dictionary, right? Even though there are like tools on the market. So if like this person should know exactly what data is available, where it's available, where there's, like, oftentimes data is being tracked, but it's not being synced to certain destinations, right? So they can be like, oh, we already have this data, but it's not yet being synced to this destination. Let me handle that for you. So I think this role is extremely important. It's still not a first class role, even though there are teams that handle this. This has been my experience so far, and yeah.
Well, and I think that's, I mean, I think that summarizes both the challenge and the opportunity, right? Because I think, you see, and as I talk to people, and actually after we put this report out, we've had, some of our customers be like, man, this 100% describes my, my role,
Nice.
or it's, oh yeah, this is what I'm doing these days. And I think the shift though, and I think this is where this gets really interesting, or at least, in my idea, in my nerd brain, it gets interesting, is that, I think we're really going from a person who may have been, an analyst, whose job was just to kind of take orders and make the connection, if you will, as you said, to now really taking a more strategic role and being able to, and afforded the opportunity to step back and say, what are our goals? What do we want to achieve? And that person is now waking up thinking about, the data that they're collecting as an enterprise, how to best leverage that asset. At Tealium, we talk a lot about, customer data being, one of your most strategic assets, because at the end of the day, from a platform, from tools, from AI models, your competitors have access to a lot of the same, raw materials, if you will, to kind of put together your stack. But it's how you use that, right? And so it's that activation of, be it customer data or, or other forms of data, that really are the thing that drive, incremental value. So now you've got a person who is sitting in the middle, not just keeping the lights on, but really, moving into that strategic role of translating, connecting the dots between, goals and objectives, and what are we tracking, what are we not doing? Because, I mean, I've seen it. I spent years in consulting before I moved into the product world, and the inevitable, request that comes from a business side that asks for a set of data. The problem is they don't know often what they don't know.
Yeah.
And then the data engineer or the analyst has to go and guess in a lot of
Yeah.
times, and we know in data, guessing is never usually the indicator of a good result. And so all of a sudden you get an audience back and it's not what you want. It's too big. It's too small. It doesn't have the detail. And you're like, oh, well, what if we did, and then this back and forth occurs between the two teams.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden 3 weeks go by to pull a list. And,
Which is
obviously,
crazy.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we don't have 3 weeks anymore. I mean, I think, that
Yeah.
was obviously CDPs. That was one of the big value props was, marketing can go in and, and self-serve and get a lot of data. And that is still true. But I think it still requires then that person who is making sure that the CDP is set up for success, that the data that is being collected, you're not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. I think, early on in the world, there was a lot of, hey, let's just tag and track everything and then we'll figure out how we use it. And
Yeah.
That I would assume you see the same thing, that there's still a strategy, in many
Yeah.
ways.
It's one of the things that has bothered me for the longest time. Like a lot of people just assume that if they just buy a CDP, all their problems will be solved. I think the biggest problem is that companies don't realize, and then basically it'll take like 6 months to actually get to that point where they start driving value, and then they'll blame the technology or the people owning the technology. But I think people don't realize that before they actually procure a CDP, they need to do this groundwork, which can take up to 6 months or should nowadays happen like much faster. But depending on your organization and the product, can take a while. That has to happen before you procure the product, right? Because like a lot of people don't think through these things, like what do we want to do with the data, or what data do we want, and they'll like this is obviously this is very true where the executive buyer or like the person procuring the product will just hand it over to the engineering team and be like, go and implement it for us without really giving them any context, right? Which invariably leads to like data bloat, lack of taxonomy. I mean, I've seen this like literally at every company I worked at. It's crazy. It's almost funny at this point. But there's something you said that really got me thinking. As an analyst, I think this is a huge opportunity because as AI is making analysis easier and faster, if you're a data analyst who really enjoys working with data, I think this could be a huge opportunity to sort of shift leftwards, and better understand the needs of like data adjacent teams and become this data strategist or a tracking manager who knows exactly what data is being collected, where it is being stored, what destinations the data is being synced to. Of course, there are like tools nowadays to document all this. I think that's the other bit for me. Like I really sort of thrived in this role because I'm almost obsessed with like documenting things and making things look good. So I would like make this detailed tracking plan and document every little thing, and make it a living document rather than a one-time thing, which pays huge dividends down the road, right? So I think what you mentioned is really interesting. Analysts should definitely lean into this role. It just makes them more valuable, allows them to bring more value across the organization. Because, like I said, like companies would still want someone who is a data person to own this role. So it also becomes easier to be that person. If you want to do this work, as opposed to someone like me who doesn't really have a background in data.
Yeah, but I think we have to think of one of the findings and one of the pieces that I as I've been talking about this is like it's not just a data analyst with a little bit more power, right? And I think the distinction is clear in the sense that you almost need to start thinking about data now as this person as like the product owner of the data sets or of your of your customer data, because now it's how do we best store it, use it, leverage it, bring the teams together. And so we're, shifting from what do I have to what do I want, and what do we want as an organization, and where are we going, and start to, put some plans together so that, in 3 months, this person is ready for whatever AI trend
Yeah.
is going to be. They're prepared for it. They're looking ahead. They're not just I think unfortunately so many data roles in organizations are spent looking backwards, right? They're looking
Yeah,
at what
exactly.
happened, what did we collect, what do we have, what does that tell us, which super important. But as we shift into kind of a new, kind of a new world with AI,
And features
wherever.
being built so fast,
Yeah,
everything is
exactly.
being built so fast. So you really have to be on top of things, like you were saying.
Yeah, and I was working on a thing the other day, and somebody asked me a question around email marketing, and it's like, well, why are organizations still hesitant, for to change, or why are we not doing personalization, or these kind of questions kind of keep coming up, and the reality is it's like, I don't think anybody's hesitant. I don't think everybody doesn't want to. It's, I don't have the resources. I don't have the energy. I,
Yeah.
as a marketer, am doing 50 things, and I have to prioritize what I'm doing. And I just don't know what data is available to me. Or if I do know what data is available to me, I can't get to it in a way that is meaningful. And hopefully this role, because it's not an integration thing anymore. I think a lot of people have solved the integration, but
Yeah.
now it's having the right data in the right place for the right use case in the right format and the right timing. There's so many other variables
From the right source.
from the
You'd
right
often
source.
have data, but the source is incorrect.
Yes.
It's crazy. Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is so true. And yeah, it's definitely a huge opportunity. Like I've never actually thought about it this way, because I always thought that you need to be like someone who's not exactly a data person, who understands the product and the business and is curious about data. But
Yeah.
if you already have some understanding of data, if you love data, if you know SQL, it really helps, because then this work becomes really easy for you. It becomes easier to translate the work to data and engineering teams. It
Right.
becomes easier to sort of go to market with new features, and companies are shipping features at a rapid pace. So you really have to be on top of the product. So basically, you have to sit like really close to the product team. You have to be close to the engineering team, because your job is not necessarily going to be to actually implement the tracking, right? You have
Right.
to be the one making sure that the tracking happens, and it happens on time and happens correctly, and most importantly, the data is available in the downstream systems,
Yeah.
which often is not the case, right? For some reason, if the data doesn't show up, campaigns get delayed, everything gets delayed, everyone suffers. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity, and I think this role could become a first class role very soon.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think to your point, it doesn't I mean, because things, and there's tools and options, you said the key word that I 100% agree with is curiosity. The person who's
Yeah.
curious about the data, who wants to understand, who looking at it to say, tell me a story, tell me a story, what is going on? I dig into data all the time. I'm not writing SQL. I mean, I can write some SQL, but I'm not writing production SQL. But I
Yeah.
sure as heck anymore
Same.
can go to Claude and have Claude write me really good SQL.
Yeah.
And so I think the opportunity for the right person becomes broader in the sense that, the it's the perspective, it's the idea that, we are almost mining through our treasure, here of bits and pieces of information that eventually are going to tell us a story and unlock, some new opportunity, some competitive advantage. And, that kind of person, I don't think just happens. I think you have to, have to find them. You have to grow that, grow that skill set, grow that talent. So from a leadership perspective, what's your advice? Well, how should a leader go about saying, yeah, okay, like, we need that. We need that person on our team.
Yeah.
What do they do? Where do they start? In your perspective and, your thoughts.
Yeah, I think as a leader, you look for people who are either like, okay, just thinking of myself, I would say look for someone who likes to build with software, because they may not be like technical or may not be a data person, but if they're like power user of tools, and the easiest proxy nowadays is workflow automation. If they're good at building automated workflows, if they understand triggers and actions, then they already like that's how I really understood the foundations of data, because at Integromat at make.com, I was also a power user of the product even before I joined the company. And as I was building more and more workflows, one fine day I had this realization that, like robust workflows are all about understanding the underlying data structures, because you're just moving data from one system to the other. And I started looking at data types more specifically. And so look for people who are like really good at building with existing tools. Like literally every organization has an automation tool in-house today. So that could be a really good proxy. And similarly, you could put out a challenge for the teams, like, okay, we're building this feature, or like, we're like come up with some hypothetical feature and get people to sort of create a simple tracking plan, depicting exactly what events they would track, which properties for each event they would track, the data types of each property, and how and the destinations where they'd want to sync each event and property, and how they would use that data, right? So if someone is able to articulate that, it shows that they understand the product, they understand the user, because then they have to anticipate how the user would use the product. They understand how these features, how they would work on increasing the adoption for those features, because essentially you're tracking those data points, and syncing the data to your email tools so that you can like bring people back into the product, right? Just getting someone to create that artifact will show, because you have to be a good thinker. You have to like really think through things, right? It's not something that you can't just go and ask, hey, we're building this feature, which events we should track. Of course you can, and the AI will give you a decent answer, but it won't really help you understand the customer journey. And it's never a one-time process, right? Tracking is never a one-time process. So you really have to be someone who's constantly thinking about, what data we should track, what data we should stop tracking, as like features get removed, or like you start killing features or whatever. You should stop tracking data that's no longer needed, right? Because it just creates bloat, and it makes the life of a marketer really hard, who has to like look at these hundreds of events,
filter
and like
through everything,
figure out. So I would say, look for people who are obviously curious and creative, but also like who love using tools, and can like articulate their thinking clearly. I think that like it can go a long way,
Yeah, I think I 100% agree. And I think the other piece in there that I would add is the person who challenges the data. I think the person who says, hey, this is telling me this, but I just don't know X. Because I'm missing either this data point, or I just don't have, like it would be great if we knew X, Y, and Z, right? And I think that person who's thinking beyond kind of, what's on the table in front of them, or what I've always been fascinated by is, there's so much ability for data to tell a story, and yes, I can get a nice table of information, but all of a sudden when I'm looking at the combination of 3 columns and I'm saying, okay, there's a pattern here that if the person is buying, blue, clothes in this region, it equates to this, and all, you have to be looking at it and thinking about it and going, well, what is this telling me? What is it? And that type of person, all of a sudden becomes, super valuable, because now they're able to kind of pose challenges and pose questions of their own now to that technical team, saying, hey, we don't have this information. How could we get it? Or they can go to the marketing team and say, hey, we have this information. How could you leverage it differently? We're tracking all of these things, and yet we're still building audiences based off of, last visit date. Could we do something else? Could we segment differently? Could we think about, personalization in a different way? I want to remind everybody, drop your questions in. I got a couple here at the end that we'll take, but if you have questions for myself, for our pit, or just in general about the report, feel free. But a couple more questions, and I think we're out of here. But so okay, let's shift this a little bit. Right now, we've talked about the leader. Let's talk quickly, as you've been that person, I've been that person. What's your advice for the people who want to go from, or in that semi-technical or in that marketing nerd kind of, lane, and they want to grow in that role or become more kind of strategic in the organization. What advice do you have there?
I would say you have to be obsessed with the details because, this kind of work is literally about obsessing over the details, because the details really make a big difference. Like, it's easy to go and like list down 5 events that you want to track, but thinking about, the event properties and like the user properties, and if you're a B2B company, thinking about the group properties, that you want to track, thinking about whether this event should be tracked as a front end event or a back end event, or should we like, whether this should be like a composite event which tracks like 3 actions rather than like creating 3 events. So like really like enjoying that process of like like I used to spend like days just thinking about this stuff and writing down things and scratching my nose and like, oh no, this doesn't make sense, maybe we should track this. And then talking to people, like talking to engineers, talking to product managers, especially people who are like closest to the product, because they have a hypothesis when they're building a product. They believe that building this will actually solve a problem for the customer will use this feature. So talking to those people, and of course talking to the marketers whose job is to like marketer or growth person whose job is to get the feature adopted. Like I think that is really important. So obsessing over the details, enjoying the process of like documenting things, and just enjoying like working with data, right? Because I never knew that I would enjoy this process as much as I did. I found out only by doing the work, only because I was forced to do the work, because we didn't at Integra, we didn't have anyone else to do this work. So so I think it's a really fun exploration if you go down this path. And I think being curious and like being obsessed with the details will really make a huge difference.
So one question that came in, from the audience really is where should this role sit? And I've got a follow up based on what you asked, because I want to challenge the thought here. But where do you think this role sits best?
I've thought about this a lot. One time I came up with this title of a growth engineer, just because everyone wants to be an engineer of some sort. But I would say like this role essentially sits at the intersection of like with data and engineering being on one side and go-to-market teams, product marketing growth being on the other. This person is literally in the middle. Now people will say, oh, that sounds like ops. Ops is again a very broad term, right? Like if you have a rev ops team, they're more focused on like revenue operations or like sales related use cases. Marketing ops takes care of marketing ops. GTM ops is a new term, and there are companies that are adopting this role. But again, that's a very broad. It's a very broad term, which entails like a bunch of different skills. So I think this person literally sits at the intersection of data engineering on one side, GTM on the other, and they really have to know or understand the needs and the priorities and the constraints of all of these teams that they're working with.
But who should they report to?
That's such a hard question. It's crazy. Maybe the head of data. Maybe the head of data, because ultimately their job is to make good data available across the organization and build a robust data infrastructure and help organizations go from good data to growth. Not just make good data available, which a lot of companies do focus on. They have great data infrastructure, they have all the fancy tools in place, but no one really knows how to use that data. So like going from good data to growth is what every organization aspires to do with their data. So I hope that answers.
It's an impossible answer or question to answer probably exactly. I think it's always like, if you're a data minded company, then I think sitting in on the data side makes sense. But then you need to build a really strong relationship and have somebody who's really strong on the business or on the marketing side. Inverse, if you're a marketing and sales led company, I think sitting on the marketing side makes sense, because obviously revenue, is the driver, and then you have to go build that credibility. You have to go and show your chops to the to the data side, if you will. So
right, okay. I was the head of growth. I was the head of growth when I was owning this role. And again, head of growth is such a broad term. Like people often use growth and marketing, simultaneously, alternatively, and sometimes head of growth, like they're more focused on sales. So like I think what you said is true. Like depending on the kind of company you are, you should decide who this person should report to. As a PLG company, it's probably like someone like a head of growth or head of product. Maybe.
Yeah. I think it's wherever they have the best access to a more strategic and to leadership, where they can help influence kind of across. To me is the more path of least resistance, as opposed to trying to fight their way through broader hierarchy. So okay, we are at time, and I want to wrap things up here. But last thought, forward looking. The world's changing. It's going to continue to change. AI is going to force, lots of things. How do you think this evolves over time? Give me your 1 minute answer of where does this go next?
I would say like this role, like no matter how much technology evolves, this role will always be an important role, especially for companies that really care about using data to drive growth, or like enabling or rather enabling all their go-to-market teams, giving them access to the right data, enabling them to actually like work with data in their day-to-day. So I think this is almost like an evergreen role, and it actually becomes even more important as companies ship more features. I think my short answer is that you got to hire this role sooner rather than later, right?
Start now.
Even if you don't have a lot to track, even if you're like, oh, we just want to track like 5 events and like start experimenting with a CDP, and if it works, then we'll try to hire this role. I think that's a classic mistake. You'd rather hire this person today so that they can help you derive value from a CDP or whatever technology you're buying today. You're spending like hundreds of thousands of dollars on the tech. Just find someone who really understands how to derive value from these tools, because you really need someone like that. Even before you procure a CDP, hire them like 6 months before you buy a CDP.
Yeah, I think that's my hot take, right? This is a strategic revenue driving opportunity as opposed to a headcount or a cost center. And I think the organizations that invest in this 100%. Today are going to be ready for tomorrow. So, Arpit, we could probably talk for another hour.
It doesn't even feel like it's been like 40 minutes. Wow, crazy.
I know. But I'm getting flagged down here, so it is time to wrap up. I want to thank everybody for joining us. You can find obviously the full report at the link in the announcements. Arpit and I are both on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with either of us. Say hi. But again, I want to thank you for joining me. And I want to thank everybody for watching, or if you're watching this on demand and you didn't get your question answered, send us a message, say hi, and we'll get to it. So, Arpit,
thank you for having me, and please do reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have any questions about this stuff. I'll always respond, and I have like tons of resources besides the report to send your way. So definitely reach out.
Awesome. All right, thank you all. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Zach. Have a good day. Bye.